Hello. Today I'm going to tell you a story about women in the Middle Ages. Close your eyes, focus on the flow of the story, and drift off to sleep. First, please subscribe and leave a comment. Every garment a medieval woman wore began with the same foundation. The chemise, known in different regions as the smock, the shift, or the chains. This was the most intimate layer of clothing. A loose, long-sleeve tunic that fell to the ankles and was worn directly against the skin, made almost universally from linen, a fabric prized for its softness and its ability to be washed. The chemise served both practical and hygienic purposes in an era when outer garments were rarely, if ever, laundered. The quality of a woman's chemise varied enormously according to her station. A peasant woman might wear a coarse, unbleached linen shift, its edges left raw, or finished with simple stitching. A noble woman, by contrast, wore fine white or cream linen, sometimes embroidered at the neck and with delicate geometric patterns or small flowers worked in colored thread or silk. These embroidered borders were not merely decorative. They were one of the few visible indicators of the luxury hidden beneath a woman's outers, glimpsed at the cuffs and collar where her chemise peeked through. Beneath the chemise, women wore no undergarments in the modern sense. The chemise itself was the undergarment. However, during menstruation, women used folded strips of cloth, sometimes referred to in period texts as clouts or rags, secured with ties or tucked into place. Leg coverings, known as hose, were worn by men as a matter of course, but the evidence for women's hose is more ambiguous. In the early medieval period, women of higher status sometimes wore woven woolen hose tied at the knee with garters, though this was far from universal. By the later medieval period, particularly from the 12th century onward, there is clearer evidence that some women wore fitted hose, especially in colder northern climates. The bleout, an over-tunic common in the 11th and 12th centuries, was often worn over the chemise with a fitted bodice laced tightly at the sides to achieve a slender silhouette. This lacing was one of the earliest methods of shaping the female form through clothing, not a corset in any later. A functional and deliberate contouring of the body's outline. The lacing was typically done with braided cords or leather thongs threaded through eyelets, cut into the fabric and bound with stitching to prevent fraying. Shoes, though not strictly undergarments, formed the base of a woman's daily dress. In the early medieval period, women wore simple leather shoes with a single seam running up the side, fastened with a leather toggle or left open. By the 13th and 14th centuries, shoes had become considerably more refined, with pointed toes and low heels coming into fashion among wealthier women. Wooden-soled pattens, raised overshoes designed to lift the wearer above muddy streets, were widely used by urban women of all social classes, protecting their more delicate indoor use from the mud and refuse of medieval streets. Chapter 2. The outer garments. Girdles, blouses, and gowns approx. Chemise minutes. Of the chemise, primary outer garment of the medieval woman was the kirtle, a word whose meaning evolved over the centuries. but which generally referred to a fitted dress worn directly over the chemise. In the early medieval period, kirtles were loose and relatively unshaped. 13th century, they had become considerably more tailored, with fitted sleeves, shaped bodices, and skirts that in soft folds to the ground. The kirtle was constructed from woven wool in most cases, a material that was versatile, warm, and available across most of medieval Europe. Wool was woven in many weights and qualities, from the heavy, coarse broadcloth used for peasant dress to the fine, tightly woven woolens of Flemish manufacture that were prized across the continent. The color of the kirtle depended entirely on the wearer's wealth. Undyed or naturally colored wools, browns, grays, and creams were the preserve of the poor. Brighter colors required expensive dyes, red from madder or the imported dye kermes, blue from wood or the costlier indigo, and the deep purple that remained, by tradition and by law in many kingdoms, the color of royalty. The cotehardie, which came into fashion in the mid-14th century, represented a more dramatic evolution in silhouette. This fitted garment was cut to follow the contours of the body closely, with a low neckline, tight-fitting sleeves that buttoned from the elbow to the wrist, and a full skirt that began from a fitted hip. The cotehardie was fashionable among noble women, prosperous Ursuline women across France, England, and the Low Countries, and its sleeves, sometimes string-long, decorative, piptipitis or fabric amen thatting for the elbow, became worn at the forming that both were markers of mid-14th century fashion. Over the kirtle or cotehardie, women often wore surcoat, a sleeveless or wide-sleeved outer garment that added both warmth and visual complexity to the ensemble. In the 14th century, the sideless surcoat became one of the most distinctive and iconic garments of medieval women's dress, cut with dramatic openings at the sides that extended from the shoulder nearly to the hip. The sideless surcoat revealed the fitted kirtle beneath while creating a striking visual frame around the body. A wide panel of fur, typically miniver, made from the belly fur of the Eurasian squirrel, ran down the front of the sideless surcoat in the most expensive versions, and its appearance was so closely associated with noble rank, sumptuary laws in several European kingdoms attempted to restrict its to women-specific social standing. The hupland, which appeared in the final decades of the 14th century and remained fashionable well into the 15th, represented yet another shift in aesthetic. This voluminous garment was characterized by an extremely high collar, sometimes standing at the back of the neck, wide sleeves that swept the ground, and rich fabric gathered at the waist with a belt. In its most extravagant form, the hopeland was made from silk velvet or brocaded cloth of gold, lined with fur, and decorated with dagged or scalloped edges along the collar and sleeves. A woman wrapped in a hopeland was enveloped in luxury, form almost entirely concealed beneath an architecture of fabric. Chapter 3. The significance of fabric, wool, linen, silk, and beyond a prompt. To understand women's dress must understand the materials from which it was made, because in the medieval world, fabric was not merely a practical material, it was a form of currency, a marker of identity, and a reflection of the vast trade networks that connected Europe to the wider world. Wool was the backbone of European textile production throughout the medieval period. From the sheep pastures of England and Spain to the weaving workshops of Flanders and Florence, wool, in its many forms, clothed the majority of Europe's population. The wool trade, one of the most economically significant enterprises of the medieval world, and the fortunes of entire cities, particularly in the Low Countries and northern Italy, were built upon it. For women, wool provided the fabric from which their everyday kirtles, cloaks, and winter garments were made. The quality of the wool determined its warmth, its drape, its durability, and ultimately its cost. Linen, grown from the flax plant and requiring considerable labor to prepare and weave, was the material of choice for undergarments and for the veils and head coverings that formed an essential part of medieval women's dress. Fine linen, bleached to a brilliant white through exposure to sunlight and repeated washing, was a luxury in its own right, and the skill of a woman's linen work was often considered a reflection of her household's prosperity and her own domestic virtue. Silk, however, is the ultimate luxury fabric of the medieval world. Imported along the Silk Road from China and silk was extraordinarily expensive and available only to the wealthiest members of society. A gown made from silk, whether plain silk, richly patterned silk damask, or the most opulent cloth of gold woven with gold thread, was a statement of power and wealth that no amount of sumptuary legislation could entirely suppress. Sumptuary laws, regulations governing who was permitted to wear what, were enacted by rulers across medieval Europe in an attempt to maintain visible social distinctions through dress. In England, France, Spain, and the Italian city-states, these laws specified with remarkable precision which fabrics, furs, colors could be worn by women of different social ranks. In England, Edward III's Statute of T63 of 13th century prohibited merchants' wives from wearing silk veils, while a woman of the gentry could wear silk but not cloth of gold, which was reserved for women of noble blood. These laws were repeatedly enacted and repeatedly ignored, their very frequency testifying to the irrepressible desire of prosperous women to dress above their station. Fur was another critical element of medieval dress that carried found social significance. Ermine, the white winter coat of the stoat, per its purity of color and associated with royalty, was reserved for queens and the highest nobility. Miniver, as mentioned earlier, was more widely available, but still costly. Rabbit, squirrel, and lamb provided more accessible fur linings for women of the middle and lower nobility. Common women who could afford any fur at all made do with cat or fox. The presence and quality of fur trim on a garment, one of the clearest and most immediate visual indicators of a woman's social rank. Chapter 4: Head Coverings and Hair. A world of meaning above the shoulders, approx. Perhaps no aspect of Noel women's dress was more laden with social and religious meaning than the covering of the head and hair. Across virtually all of medieval European society, a woman's hair was considered deeply personal, intimately connected to her sexuality and her honor. For a married woman, covering the hair was not merely a custom. It was a moral obligation enforced by social expectation, and in many contexts, by ecclesiastical injunction. In the early medieval period, women covered their hair with a simple linen veil worn over the head and allowed to fall over the shoulders. This veil, known in various regions as coverchef or the coverchief, was the foundational head covering of medieval women's dress and remained in use in some form throughout the entire medieval period. It was held in place by a narrow band of fabric or a barbette, a linen band that passed under the chin and pinned to the hair above the ears, and could be worn alone or in combination with other head coverings. Young unmarried girls, by contrast, were often depicted and described with their hair uncovered, worn loose, braided, or bound with simple ribbons. The transition from uncovered hair to covered head marked a woman's passage into marriage and adult female identity, and in some contexts, the ceremonial covering of a bride's hair with a veil formed important symbolic element of the marriage ceremony itself. The wimple, which became particularly fashionable in the 13th century, was a more elaborate form of head covering that enclosed not only the head, but also the neck and chin. Made from fine linen pleated or draped to cover the throat, the wimple was worn beneath a veil or in religious contexts, beneath a nun's habit. Its association with piety and modesty made it popular beyond religious life, and noble women and matrons of the 13th century wore elaborate wimples as a standard element of respectable dress. By the 14th and 15th centuries, head coverings had evolved into extraordinary and sometimes fantastical constructions. The hennin, that iconic towering conical headdress associated in popular imagination with the medieval princess, was a product of the 15th century, fashionable primarily in France and Burgundy, and never as universal as a later artistic tradition would suggest. More widely worn across the later medieval period were the padded rolls and turbans of fabric worn around the head, the reticulated headdresses with jeweled culls encasing the hair on either side of the face, and the elaborate butterfly headdresses of the Burgundian court, their transparent veils, stretched over wire frames to dramatic architectural effect. The hair itself, when visible at all, was carefully, and its management was considered an important feminine art. Women plaited their hair, coiled it above the ears in jeweled nets called crespines or crespinets, and pinned or braided it in patterns that varied according to fashion and regional tradition. Only in the privacy of their homes and bedchambers, or in certain artistic contexts, were medieval women depicted with their hair entirely uncovered and unbound. an image that carried powerful connotations of intimacy, vulnerability, or, in the case of penitential imagery, shame. Chapter 5e. Dress and Social Class. From the Peasant to the Queen. Approx. King's Minutes. The medieval world was a world where rigidly hierarchical one, and nowhere was this hierarchy more visibly expressed than in dress. From the roughest peasant woman burrowing in the fields to the most magnificently arrayed queen presiding a royal court, every woman's clothing reflected and reinforced her position in the social order. To dress above one's station was not merely a social faux pas. It was, in many contexts, a legal offense and a moral transgression. The peasant woman of medieval Europe dressed ruthless practicality. Her wardrobe, typically consisting of no more than 2 or 3 garments in total, was designed the demands of hard physical labor, while providing protection from the cold. A rough linen chemise formed the base. Over it, she wore a simple woolen kirtle, its hem raised when working to keep it clear of mud, its sleeves rolled or tied back. In colder months, a woolen cloak or a simple mantle provided additional warmth. Her head was covered with a linen coif, a close-fitting cap tied beneath the chin, or a cloth wrapped and knotted around the head. She wore leather shoes, or in the warmest months went barefoot. Color, for the peasant woman, was largely absent. The gray, brown, and undyed cream of natural wool, the rust of cheap dye, the occasional dirty blue of poorly mordanted wood. These were the colors of poverty, not because peasant women lacked the desire for color, but because mordants, dye plants, and the labor of dyeing were all costly, and the deepest, most lasting colors demanded the most expensive inputs. The vibrant scarlets and royal blues of court dress were as remote from a peasant woman's daily reality as the silk they were made from. As one moved up the social scale, complexity and costliness increased proportionally. The wife of a prosperous merchant in a city like London, Paris, or Florence, an interesting and often contested position in the social hierarchy of dress. She had access to fine fabrics through trade connections, but sumptuary laws frequently targeted her class specifically, attempting to prevent the conflation of mercantile wealth with aristocratic status. Such women often wore good quality woolly ed in respectable colors, with modest fur trim at the collar and cuffs, and linen of superior courtier quality for their veils and undergarments. Their dress communicated prosperity and respectability, without aspiring to the extravagance of the nobility. Noble women dressed as their rank required, and as their income permitted. A minor noblewoman in a rural English manor might wear well-made, but relatively simple kirtles in good quality wool, while a great countess at the English royal court might possess dozens of gowns in silk, velvet, and cloth, scepter of gold, lined with ermine and adorned with jewels. Household accounts from noble estates throughout the medieval period record in meticulous detail the enormous sums spent on clothing for the ladies of the household. Not merely their outer garments, but their shoes, their gloves, their belts, and the quantities of linen required for their chemises, and head coverings. At the very apex of medieval society, the queen's dress was not merely clothing. It was political theater. A queen appearing in the great hall of her palace, robed in cloth of gold and crowned with a diadem, draped in furs and jewels, embodied in her person the power, wealth, and legitimacy of her dynasty. The wardrobe accounts of English queens from Eleanor of Provence in the 10th century to Catherine of Aragon in the early 16th reveal the extraordinary quantities of silk, velvet, gold thread, and threms, these gems that were consumed in the construction of royal female dress. These garments were gifts of state, diplomatic tools, and visual arguments for the greatness of the realm. As carefully crafted and as deliberately deployed as any political speech. Chapter 6. The Dressed Body in Motion. Belts, accessories, and jewelry. Approx. 10 minutes. The maiden's dress was completed and given its final form, not only by the garments themselves, but by the accessories that accompanied them. Belts, girdles, purses, gloves, jewelry, and even the manner in which the dress was carried and held in motion, all significant elements of the total presentation of a good-dressed medieval woman. The belt or girdle was perhaps the most functionally and symbolically significant accessory in a medieval woman's wardrobe, worn at the waist or hips depending on fashion. The girdle served the practical purpose of controlling the voluminous fabric of outer garments, creating the fitted silhouette that medieval fashion repeatedly sought, but also served as a means of display. The girdles of wealthy women were made from braided silk, embroidered leather, or, most magnificently, from linked plates of silver or gold set with gemstones. From the girdle hung a variety of useful objects: a small purse or pouch containing coins or personal items, a set of keys, the symbol of a married woman's domestic authority, scissors, a small knife, oif, or a pomander, a perforated metal case filled with aromatic herbs or spices that scented the air. Around the wearer, rings were worn freely by women of all social classes who could afford them, and even simple bronze rings set with glass paste stones brought a touch of color and ornament within reach of women of modest means. Brooches, both decorative and functional purposes, pinning cloaks, fastening veils, and securing the neck openings of gowns. Ear ornaments appear less commonly in the archaeological and artistic record than rings and brooches, though they were not entirely absent. Necklaces of beads, glass, amber, or precious stone, depending on wealth, were worn from the early medieval period onward. Gloves were an important accessory for women of higher rank, serving both practical and ceremonial purposes. Leather gloves protected the hands during hawking, riding, and outdoor activity. Embroidered fabric gloves were worn at court and on formal occasions. In the highly ceremonial world of the medieval court, the giving and receiving of gloves carried specific symbolic weight, and queen or great lady's gloves were among the more intimate gifts she might bestow. The overall visual effect of a fully dressed medieval noble woman was one of layered richness, a multiplicity of fabrics, colors, and textures moving together as she walked. The suzeraus of silk, the soft weight of fur at the collar, the glint of jewelry at the neck and in fingers, the sway of a jeweled girdle. All of these elements combined to create a visual and sensory presence that was carefully constructed and entirely intentional. Chapter Stephen, Religious Women, Dress in the Cloister, Approx. Temenings. The medieval world was a profoundly religious one, and a significant proportion of its women within religious communities, as nuns, canonesses, anchoresses, or lay sisters. For these women, the principles governing dress even more strictly defined than for their secular counterparts. And the habit of a religious woman was itself a theological statement of Ziba Enakma and of her separation from the world and her dedication to God. The Benedictine rule, which governed the dress of women in the oldest and most widespread monastic tradition, called simplicity, uniformity, and the avoidance of anything that might excite vanity or draw attention to the individual. Black wool was the standard color for Benedictine nuns, though white was adopted by the Cistercian Reform movement in the 12th century as a symbol of purity and the rejection of Benedictine elaboration. Dominican sisters wore the distinctive black and white habit of their order, while Franciscan tertiaries and the Poor Clares wore brown or gray wool of the coarsest available quality, in deliberate imitation of the poverty embraced by their founder. What all these habits shared was a common structure: a long tunic, a scapular worn over it, and a veil covering the head and neck. The veil was of white wood, depending on a nun's status as within the community. Novices wore white veils in many traditions, while professed nuns wore black. Beneath the veil, a linen coif or wimple covered the hair entirely, the hair itself having been shorn at the time of profession, as a symbol of the renunciation of worldly identity. Yet even within the convent, the pressure of worldly fashion was not entirely absent. The records of monastic visitations, official inspections of religious houses by bishops or abbots, frequently record complaints about nuns wearing fashionably shaped sleeves, owning fine linen of excessive quality, or adorning their habits with small embroidered ornaments. These infractions are a reminder that the women who entered medieval convents but brought with them the habits and tastes of their social class, and that the struggle between religious simplicity and human vanity was real within the cloister as without. Some religious women, however, turned the arts of needlework and embroidery to sacred purposes, producing liturgical embroideries of extraordinary beauty. The English Opus Anglicanum, as it was known across Europe, represented the highest achievement of medieval textile art, and much of it was produced in convents and by devout laywomen working under ecclesiastical commission. In this context, the skills of dress and the crafts of the textile worker were not vanity, but devotion. Chapter 8. Regional Variations. Dress across medieval Europe. Approx. Mimenis in medieval Europe was not a monolithic cultural space. From the fjords of Norway to the sun-baked plains of style, From the busy cloth markets of Bruges to the Byzantine sophistication of Constantinople, women's dress varied considerably according to climate, local textile production, cultural tradition, and proximity to major trade routes. While the broad principles of female dress, the layering of chemise, kirtle, and outer garment, the covering of the hair, the use of wool and linen as primary materials, remained relatively consistent across the continent. Thus the specific forms they took were shaped by local conditions. In Northern Europe, in England, northern France, Flanders, and the Germanic lands, the cold climate favored heavier wool and more complete coverage of the body. Cloaks and mantles were essential garments rather than merely formal accessories, and fur lining was used for warmth as well as display. Head coverings were heavy and enveloping, and women rarely left the house without their head completely covered, both for warmth and propriety. In Mediterranean Europe, in southern France, the Italian peninsula, and Iberian kingdoms, lighter fabrics and looser silhouettes were more common, reflecting both the warmer climate and the greater availability of imported silks from Byzantine and later Italian manufacturers. Spanish women's dress showed strong Moorish influence in its earlier medieval phases, particularly in Castile and Aragon, where the rich textile traditions of Al-Andalus, including the production of luxury silk and fine embroidered linen, influenced Christian dress whilst, after the Reconquista had pushed the Islamic presence southward. In the Italian city-states of the 13th and 14th centuries, the extraordinary wealth generated by banking and in international trade created a unique environment for the development of fashion. Florentine and Venetian merchant women had access to silk damasks, brocades, and velvets in the city's own workshops. And the competition for status through dress was intense enough to generate some of the most detailed and frequently updated sumptuary legislation in all of Europe. The account books, Tussle inventories, and dowry records that survive from these cities provide an unparalleled window into the actual contents of medieval women's wardrobes. The number of gowns, the types of fabric, the colors, the value of each garment. In the Byzantine East, women's dress followed quite different conventions, rooted in the Roman traditions that Byzantium preserved and elaborated. Byzantine court dress for women was characterized by long, heavily draped garments, elaborate embroidery, and the extensive use of silk, a fabric that Byzantium controlled the production of. In the West for centuries, the loros, the jeweled ceremonial collar worn by empresses, was among the most opulent garments produced anywhere in the medieval world. And though Byzantium fell the Ottomans in 453, its influence on Western European dress, particularly in the use of patterned silk and the taste for embroidered borders, had been flowing westward through trade and diplomacy for centuries. Chapter 9. Dressing the Body Through Time. How fashion changed across the centuries. Approx. 12 minutes fashion as we understand it today. The rapid, seasonal cycle of changing styles did not exist in the medieval world in the same form. Change was slower, driven not by commercial cycle, but by the movements of courts, the influence of powerful queens and noblewomen, and the gradual diffusion of styles through trade routes, dynastic marriages. Yet change there was, and across the 1,000 years of the medieval period, the silhouette and style of women's dress transformed significantly. In the early medieval period, roughly from the 6th to the 10th century, women's dress across Europe was relatively simple in construction, though not necessarily an ornament. Long, loose tunics of a wool or linen, worn in layers, were the norm. Decorative work was concentrated at the visible edges of garments, the neck, wrists, and hem, and took the form of woven tabletwork borders, or embroidery in wool, or, for the wealthy, silk and gold thread. The overall effect was one of enveloping richness at the borders and comparative simplicity through the body of the garment. The 11th and 12th centuries saw the introduction of more tailored forms, with the blouses, fitted torso, and long trailing sleeves representing an early experimentation with body-conscious silhouette. The Crusades and the increased trade routes they stimulated brought greater quantities of silk into Western Europe, and with them came exposure to Byzantine and Islamic textile traditions that influenced both fabrics used and the patterns woven into them. The 13th century marked a period of relative consolidation, with the fitted kirtle and linen wimple becoming the standard forms of respectable dress for noble women across most of Western Europe. The 14th century, however, was one of the most dramatic periods of change in medieval women's dress. New techniques allowed garments to be cut more closely to the body. The development of buttons, a deceptively simple innovation with profound consequences for fashion, allowed sleeves and bodices to be fitted with unprecedented precision. The code-hardy's tight sleeves, buttoned from elbow to wrist, were possible only because of this new technology. The Black Death, which swept through Europe from 347, had complex and somewhat paradoxical effects on dress. Sumptuary laws multiplied in its aftermath, as monarchs and city governments tried to reassert order through the control of dress. Yet the disruption to traditional hierarchies created by massive mortality, combined with the sudden availability of the possessions of the dead, also created new social mobility, was often expressed through dress. The decades following the Black Death saw some of the most extravagant and innovative fashions of the entire medieval period. The dagged edges, the fantastic headdresses, the trailing sleeves, as if the survivors were asserting life through the most vivid forms, self-presentation available too. The 15th century brought the soft, rounded curves of the Burgundian court into fashion, with the tall hennin and elaborate padded collars of the houppelande defining the visual language of aristocratic female dress across Northern Europe. As the century progressed toward its close, the influence of Italian Renaissance aesthetics began to work its northward, prefiguring the dramatic change in dress and in the understanding of the female body that would transform European fashion in the centuries to come. Chapter 10: the art of making women cloth and the labor of dress, prox. No account of medieval women's dress is complete without an account of the labor required to produce it. In a world without industrial textile manufacture, every yard of cloth that clothed a woman's body had been produced by human hands, and in many cases, by women's hands specifically. The arts of spinning, weaving, dyeing, embroidering, and sewing were not merely skills but vocations, and the textile arts occupied a central place in the economic and cultural life of medieval women at every social level. Spinning was the most universal of these arts. In the early medieval period and throughout, the distaff and spindle, the tools of hand spinning, were so closely associated with women that the distaff side became a standard term for the female line of a family in legal and genealogical contexts. Women spin wool, flax, and hemp into thread and yarn in every spare moment of their daily lives. Spinning while walking, spinning while minding children, spinning in the evenings by firelight. The introduction of the spinning wheel into Europe, which occurred gradually from the 13th century onward, increased the speed at which thread could be produced. The fundamental femininity of the craft remained unchanged. Weaving, in the domestic context, was also largely women's work, though the industrial-scale weaving workshops of the great cloth-producing cities were staffed largely by men. Women wove on simple upright or horizontal looms in their own homes, producing the plain cloth from which everyday garments were cut, or working more complex pattern weaves for domestic furnishings and decorative work. Women also worked as professional weavers in urban textile workshops and guild. Records of cities, Paris and London, record the presence of women in the textile trades at various levels of skill and authority. Embroidery was perhaps the most socially prestigious of the textile arts, the one most closely associated with noble and aristocratic women. Though practiced at various levels of skill across the entire social spectrum, young noble women were taught to embroider as part of their education, and the skill was considered a virtue as well as an accomplishment. The finest embroideries of the medieval period, the Bayeux tapestry, the magnificent English Anglican vestments, the embroidered altar frontals and vestments of the great cathedrals, required extraordinary skill, time, and materials, and their production represented an enormous investment of. For most women, however, the textile arts were not a leisure accomplishment, but an economic necessity. The ability to spin, weave, and sew was inseparable from the management of a household, and a woman who could not clothe her family was failing in one of her primary social functions. The dress on a medieval woman's back was therefore not merely a reflection of social status and her aesthetic preferences. It was also evidence of her own labor and that of the women around her. Every stitch was small testimony to the invisible work that sustained the visible world. Conclusion: the enduring language of medieval dress. 10 minutes. To study how medieval women dressed is to enter a world in which clothing was never neutral. Every fabric, every color, every layer Every head covering spoke a language. Medieval people read as instinctively as we read one another's appearance today, though with different vocabulary and different stakes. The chemise, the curl, the surcoat, the wimple, the girdle of jeweled plates. Each was a word in that language. Together they formed the sentences with which medieval women communicated who they were, or who they aspired to be. What is perhaps most remarkable, looking back across 1,000 years, is how much variation existed within a system that appears, from the outside, so rigidly constrained within the framework of hierarchical dress, within the boundaries imposed by sumptuary law and ecclesiastical expectation. Medieval women exercised real creativity and real agency. They chose their colors within the range available to them. They adopted new fashions, adapted them to their own circumstances, and sometimes defied the laws that sought to restrict them. They embroidered their chemises and their veils with patterns of their own devising. They brought to the art of dress the same ingenuity and expressiveness that human beings have always brought to the way they present themselves. The gowns of medieval women have long since turned to dust. What survive are the fragments, the embroidered borders unearthed from graves, the pigmented figures in illuminated manuscripts, the stiff Madonnas of altarpiece paintings dressed in the fashions of their own day. Through these remnants, through the household accounts and the sumptuary tales and the cautionary sermons against female vanity, we piece together a picture of a world in which dress was not an afterthought, but a fundamental expression of self, society, and faith. Medieval women wore their world on their bodies, and in doing so, they left us, when into the surviving threads of history, a rich and lasting record of who they were.